Welcome back to the channel. If you're here late at night looking for a story to drift off to, you're in the right place. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Marina Hale grew up in the quiet town of Redfield, Kansas, a place where everyone seemed to know everyone else's routines. The Hale household was loud, structured, and full of movement. Marina was the second oldest of 5 children, raised by her father, Thomas Hale, a former Marine and now a high school history teacher, and her mother, Susan Hale, a nurse who worked long shifts at the county hospital. Discipline and routine shaped the family, but so did warmth. Dinner was rarely silent, and weekends were reserved for shared chores, movie nights, and long conversations at the kitchen table. From a young age, Marina stood out as focused and determined. She was not reckless or impulsive. She planned things carefully, thought before she spoke, and carried herself with a calm confidence that made adults trust her easily. While other kids talked about leaving Redfield someday in vague terms, Marina talked about it with purpose. She wanted structure, challenge, and meaning. She wanted to serve. Her decision to enlist in the military after graduating high school surprised no one who truly knew her. Her father had served years earlier, and although he never pushed his children toward the military, Marina admired the sense of duty it had given him. She saw it as a way to contribute to something larger than herself, while also building a future. College could wait. This felt right. At 19, Marina enlisted in the United States Army and completed basic training with strong evaluations. She was eventually assigned to a communications unit and deployed overseas to Camp Darrow, a large military base located in a desert region of the Middle East. The environment was harsh and unfamiliar, but Marina adapted quickly. She worked long hours in a secure communications building, handling equipment, monitoring transmissions, and maintaining systems that kept operations running smoothly. Despite the distance and the time difference, Marina called home often. She spoke to her parents at least once a week, sometimes more. The calls were usually brief, squeezed in between shifts or late at night, but they were consistent. She talked about the heat, the food, the boredom, and the strange mix of intensity and monotony that came with life on base. She never sounded fearful. If anything, she sounded proud. In early December, Marina called home with excitement in her voice that Susan immediately noticed. She told her parents that her unit had been informed she would be returning home earlier than expected for the holidays. She talked about helping decorate the tree, seeing her younger siblings, and sitting on the couch with her mother watching movies like they used to. She laughed during the call, teasing her father about whether he had finally fixed the old porch light. She sounded like herself, Susan would later say, happy, calm, looking forward to coming home. That phone call would be the last time the Hale family ever heard Marina's voice. Just days later, on a cold afternoon, 2 uniformed soldiers arrived at the Hale home. Thomas knew something was wrong the moment he saw the car pull into the driveway. Years of military experience had taught him how these visits worked. Susan answered the door, and before the words were even spoken, she felt her chest tighten. They told the family that Marina was dead. The explanation came quickly and awkwardly, as if rehearsed but not fully understood by the men delivering it. They said there had been an incident on base. They said Marina had been found deceased in a contractor housing area. They said the initial conclusion was suicide. Susan felt as if the room tilted. Thomas stood frozen, listening closely, his mind already catching on the details that did not make sense. Suicide. The word echoed in the air, hollow and wrong. They had spoken to Marina just days earlier. She had been making plans. She was excited. She had talked about the future, about coming home, about life beyond the base. Nothing about that call suggested despair or instability. The soldiers offered condolences and assured the family that the Army was conducting an investigation. They said more information would follow. Then they left. In the hours that followed, shock gave way to confusion. Confusion gave way to questions. The family gathered in the living room, replaying every recent conversation with Marina. Her siblings cried quietly. Thomas sat at the table, staring at nothing, already preparing himself for a fight he did not yet understand. Over the next several days, fragments of information trickled in. According to the Army, Marina had completed her work shift sometime in the late afternoon. She was expected to attend a routine physical training session later that evening, but she never arrived. Instead, they claimed she spent several hours in the company of a male soldier in his quarters. They said the two later went to a small shopping area on base before separating. Hours later, sometime after midnight, Marina's body was discovered inside a contractor tent located away from her assigned living area. She had been shot. The Army concluded that Marina had taken her own life using a service rifle. They stated she was emotionally distressed due to a recent breakup with a romantic partner and had destroyed personal letters before ending her life. Susan could barely process what she was hearing. Marina had mentioned no relationship troubles. In fact, she had barely mentioned dating at all. Her focus had always been work and home. Thomas immediately requested records, reports, and timelines, but was told the investigation was ongoing and details were limited. When the Army recommended a closed casket funeral, citing the condition of Marina Lottie, Thomas refused without hesitation. He wanted to see his daughter. He needed to understand. When Marina's body was returned to the United States weeks later, the family gathered for the viewing. The moment Susan saw her daughter, something inside her broke. Marina's face looked wrong. There were visible injuries that did not align with what the Army had described. Her nose appeared damaged. Her lips showed signs of trauma. There was no visible injury where they had claimed the fatal shot entered. Thomas, standing only feet away, noticed even more. The wound visible on her head was small and located on the side, not consistent with the explanation he had been given. He also noticed that gloves had been placed on Marina's hands and appeared to have been fixed unnaturally. None of it made sense. The family requested the autopsy report. Weeks passed, then months. When the report finally arrived, it raised more questions than answers. The language suggested that the conclusion of suicide had been reached early in the process. Important procedures that Thomas expected, based on his own military experience, had not been performed. There was no evidence that a full forensic examination had been conducted, no comprehensive testing, no detailed analysis of alternative possibilities. Thomas began to feel a growing certainty settle in his chest. Whatever had happened to Marina, it was not being fully investigated. The more the family pushed for clarity, the more resistance they encountered. Requests for records were delayed, phone calls went unanswered. Each conversation felt carefully controlled, as if the story had already been decided. Susan struggled to sleep. She replayed Marina's final phone call over and over in her mind. The laughter, the plans, the certainty that her daughter was coming home. Thomas made a decision. If the Army would not provide answers, he would find them himself. By the end of the year, the Hale family hired an independent investigator. It was the first step into a much darker and more complicated reality than they ever expected. And it was only the beginning. The investigator Thomas Hale hired was a former civilian homicide detective named Richard Collins, a quiet man with decades of experience and no patience for half answers. From the beginning, Collins was clear about one thing. He could not promise justice, he could only promise truth, or at least the closest version of it that evidence would allow. His first request was simple. He wanted everything. Every report, every photograph, every log, every email, every piece of documentation related to Marina's death. That request alone took nearly 2 months to fulfill. When the files finally arrived, they came in layers. Some documents were heavily redacted, others were incomplete. Several key timelines contradicted each other outright. Collins spread the paperwork across the dining room table, sorting dates, names, and locations, while Thomas and Susan watched in silence. One of the first inconsistencies involved Marina's movements on the day she died. According to official records, Marina clocked out of her communications shift between 4 and 5 p.m. She was scheduled for physical training later that evening, something her unit considered mandatory unless excused. There was no documentation showing she had been excused, yet no one reported her absence until hours later. The report claimed Marina voluntarily met with a male soldier after work and remained in his room for nearly 4 hours. There was no witness statement explaining why this meeting occurred, no confirmation from a supervisor, and no record of where Marina was supposed to be during that time. "She just disappears from the schedule," Collins said, tapping the paper. "That doesn't happen by accident." The next section of the file focused on the location where Marina's body was found. The contractor tent was not part of her assigned living quarters. It was located in a less trafficked area of the base, used primarily for civilian contractors and storage. There was no clear explanation for why Marina would have gone there alone in the middle of the night. The crime scene photos told a much darker story than the official summary. Collins laid them out carefully, one by one. Susan could barely look. Thomas forced himself to study every image. Marina's face showed significant trauma. Bruising around the eye, swelling along the jaw, her nose was visibly broken. Several teeth appeared loose or damaged. These injuries were not consistent with a single gunshot wound. There's evidence of blunt force trauma, multiple impacts. This didn't happen after death. Even more disturbing were signs of chemical burns in intimate areas of Marina's body, something never mentioned in the Army's public explanation. Collins explained that such damage could indicate an attempt to destroy biological evidence. No suicide investigation skips this, not unless someone already knows what conclusion they want. The gunshot wound itself raised even more questions. The entry wound was small and located on the side of Marina's head. There was no exit wound documented, no recovered bullet listed in the evidence inventory. The report claimed Marina used an M16 rifle, yet the wound characteristics were more consistent with a smaller caliber weapon. Thomas stared at the diagram in disbelief. She's 5'1". There's no way she could physically position that rifle the way they're describing. Collins agreed. The mechanics simply did not add up. Another glaring issue involved gunshot residue. The report noted minimal residue on Marina's hands, an unusual finding in a self-inflicted gunshot death. There was also a documented trail of blood outside the tent, suggesting movement after injury, something that contradicted the suicide narrative. Despite all this, the conclusion remained unchanged: suicide. As Collins continued reviewing the files, he noticed something else. The autopsy appeared to have been conducted with the assumption of suicide from the start. There was no mention of a sexual assault examination, no nail scrapings, no analysis of defensive wounds. This isn't an investigation, it's damage control. Thomas felt a familiar anger rise in his chest, but beneath it was something colder. Fear. Fear that the truth, whatever it was, involved someone powerful enough to ensure it stayed buried. As the investigation expanded, Collins began reaching out to other families who had experienced similar losses. The pattern was unsettling. Young servicewomen found dead under questionable circumstances, rapid conclusions of suicide, limited transparency, resistance when families asked questions. Several of the cases shared striking similarities: facial injuries dismissed as incidental, missing evidence, autopsies that appeared rushed or incomplete, families left to grieve while fighting an institution that refused to acknowledge doubt. Susan struggled with the emotional weight of it all. Some days she felt numb, other days she felt consumed by grief and anger. She kept Marina's room exactly the way it had been before deployment. Her clothes still hung in the closet, her books still sat on the desk. At night, Susan replayed Marina's last call in her mind, the laughter, the plans, the promise of coming home. There was no room in that memory for despair. Collins eventually requested access to the original crime scene photos in full resolution. When those arrived, they revealed even more troubling details: the placement of the weapon, the positioning of Marina's body, the scattered papers nearby, allegedly burned letters, showed no clear signs of fire damage. It looked staged, like someone wanted it to look like a suicide but didn't know how one actually looks. The Army's response to the family's growing concerns was consistent, polite, firm, closed. They maintained that Marina had been emotionally unstable in the days leading up to her death, despite phone records and witness statements suggesting otherwise. They cited unnamed sources who claimed she was depressed, but provided no documentation. When Thomas requested to speak directly with the male soldier Marina reportedly spent time with that evening, the request was denied. Security footage from the shopping area was said to be unavailable. Emails went unanswered. The case was officially closed. But the Hale family refused to let it end there. Thomas began speaking publicly. He contacted journalists, advocacy groups, and military accountability organizations. Susan gave interviews, despite how painful it was, believing that silence would only protect those responsible. Slowly, Marina's story reached a wider audience. Other families came forward. Patterns were discussed openly. Pressure began to build. Behind the scenes, Collins continued working quietly, following leads that official channels refused to pursue. He suspected that Marina had been assaulted, possibly with someone with rank or influence, and that her death had been staged to protect a reputation and avoid scandal. There are people on that base who know what happened, and someone made sure they stayed quiet. Years passed. The Army never reopened the case, but the questions never went away, and neither did the fight. By the time the public had largely moved on, the Hale family was still searching for answers, still pushing against an institution that refused to admit failure. What they did not know yet was that the truth, when it finally emerged, would not come from the military at all. It would come from somewhere far away. And that would change everything. The break did not come from the military, and it did not come quickly. It arrived quietly, years after Marina Hale was buried, in the form of a phone call Richard Collins received late one evening from a woman who refused to give her full name. She said she had worked as a civilian contractor on the same base where Marina died. She said she had kept silent because she was afraid. She said she could not stay silent anymore. What she told Collins confirmed his worst suspicions. According to her, Marina had been seen arguing with a senior non-commissioned officer the night she died. The argument had taken place near the communications building, not in a barracks room as the official report claimed. The woman said Marina looked frightened, not angry, and the officer appeared intoxicated. She remembered it clearly because Marina had asked her for help finding a supervisor, something that had been dismissed at the time as nothing more than stress. Within hours of that confrontation, Marina was dead. The woman said there were rumors on base almost immediately that Marina had reported unwanted attention, that she had threatened to go up the chain of command, that someone with influence had panicked. The suicide story, she said, spread faster than any facts. When Collins asked why she had waited so long, the woman paused before answering. She said she had signed multiple non-disclosure agreements. She said she had been warned that speaking out would end her career and possibly worse. She said she had watched other women leave the base suddenly after asking questions. "I don't want her family to think she was forgotten," she said before hanging up. Collins brought the information to Thomas and Susan with careful restraint. He did not exaggerate. He did not promise more than he could deliver. But for the first time, there was a living witness whose account directly contradicted the official timeline. Thomas felt something shift inside him. For years, he had been told he was chasing ghosts, that grief was clouding his judgment, that the system, flawed as it might be, had done its job. Now he knew better. The family pushed for renewed attention, armed with this testimony and others like it that began to surface once Marina's story re-entered the public eye. Advocacy groups amplified the case, journalists asked harder questions, lawmakers requested briefings. Still, the military did not reopen the investigation. Instead, they issued carefully worded statements reaffirming their original conclusion while acknowledging the family's pain. No names were released, no accountability offered, no explanation for the missing evidence. Susan stopped expecting justice from official channels. What she wanted now was acknowledgement, an admission that Marina deserved better, that her life was not reduced to a convenient narrative. As the years passed, Thomas noticed something else. The officer rumored to be involved had quietly transferred out of the unit not long after Marina's death. Later records showed early retirement with honors, no disciplinary action, no public record of misconduct. The silence was deafening. Collins eventually compiled his findings into a comprehensive report outlining the inconsistencies, the mishandled evidence, the witness accounts, and the broader pattern of similar cases. It was not a legal victory, but it was a truth document, something that could not easily be erased. The report circulated among watchdog organizations and families facing similar battles. Marina's name became part of a larger conversation about systemic failure, about how institutions protect themselves at the expense of individuals. Thomas and Susan never stopped speaking her name. They attended memorials, they testified at panels, they wrote letters that often went unanswered. Sometimes it felt futile, sometimes it felt necessary. One evening, years after Marina's death, Susan received a message from a young woman currently serving overseas. She said Marina's story had made her report something she had been afraid to acknowledge. She said she no longer felt alone. Susan cried after reading it, not from sadness, but from something closer to purpose. Marina never came home the way she had promised. She never decorated that Christmas tree. She never got the life she had earned. But she was not erased. Her story lived on in the questions that refused to disappear, in the families who demanded better, and in the growing insistence that silence was no longer acceptable. The military never changed its ruling, but the truth did not need their permission to exist. And for Thomas and Susan Hale, that truth, however painful, was the only thing that allowed them to keep going. The town of Pine Hollow sat just off a 2-lane highway in western South Carolina, the kind of place where front doors were rarely locked and everyone knew which cars belonged on which streets. On February 12, 2001, 9-year-old Leela Mae Turner went to bed believing the next day would be ordinary. School, church chatter, a quick breakfast at the kitchen table. Nothing about that Sunday evening hinted that it would be the last time her family would see her at home. Leela lived in a modest brick house with her parents, Marcus and Denise Turner, and her older brother, Caleb, who was 10. Their lives revolved around family gatherings, school events, and the small Baptist church a few blocks away. Leela was quiet by nature, painfully shy around strangers, and deeply attached to routines. She hated storms, refused to sleep with the lights off, and clung to her mother whenever thunder rolled through Pine Hollow. That night, a traffic accident on Route 41 knocked out power across their neighborhood. With the house plunged into darkness, Denise decided to skip the usual bedtime bath. She told the kids they would wake up early and bathe in the morning before school. Leela accepted this without complaint, already curled up in bed with her favorite nightshirt folded neatly beside her pillow for the next day. By 8:30 p.m., both children were asleep in the room they shared. Denise set her alarm for an hour earlier than usual, kissed them goodnight, and joined the quiet of the powerless house. Rain began falling not long after, tapping steadily against the windows, accompanied by distant thunder. The power returned shortly after midnight. Marcus came home from his late shift at the warehouse around 12:45 a.m., surprised to see the lights back on. He checked on the kids, watched television for a while, and finally headed to bed around 2:30 a.m. Before lying down, he opened the door to the children's room and saw them both asleep under their blankets. Sometime later, Caleb stirred. He would later tell police he remembered seeing Leela standing near the doorway, already dressed. He assumed she was going to the bathroom. It wasn't unusual for her to wake during storms, and he drifted back to sleep without giving it another thought. At 5:30 a.m., Denise's alarm sounded. She padded down the hallway, planning to start the morning early. When she opened the children's bedroom door, she saw Caleb asleep, but Leela's bed was empty. At first, Denise thought her daughter had gone to the bathroom or into the kitchen. She checked every room in the house, growing more uneasy with each empty space. Leela was gone. The Turners called family members first, hoping someone might have picked her up early. No one had seen her. Within the hour, they called the police. Officers arrived to a quiet scene. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no disturbed locks. Leela's bed looked untouched. The house felt normal in a way that made everything worse. When police confirmed that Leela's backpack and clothes were missing, they began to consider the possibility that she had left on her own. Denise rejected that idea immediately. Leela would not run away. She was afraid of the dark, afraid of storms, afraid of dogs. The rain had been heavy that night, the sky loud with thunder. There was no world in which her daughter would voluntarily walk outside alone. The town woke up to the news by mid-morning. Volunteers gathered, roads were blocked, woods were searched. Flyers were printed and taped to windows, doors, and gas pumps. Pine Hollow felt frozen in place, waiting for an answer that did not come. Later that afternoon, police released Leela's description to the public. That was when the calls began. A long-haul truck driver said he had seen a young girl walking south along Route 41 between 3:30 and 4 a.m. She was alone, wearing light-colored clothes and carrying a backpack. Another motorist reported seeing the same child not far from the first sighting. He said he turned his car around to check on her. When he slowed down and called out, the girl panicked and ran into the trees lining the highway. Police confirmed the clothing described matched items missing from Leela's room. The idea that Leela had been walking along a dark highway in the middle of a storm stunned the community. Search efforts shifted towards Route 41 and the surrounding woods. Dogs were brought in, ditches were searched. Nothing turned up. 2 days later, another lead surfaced. A woman who worked at a small upholstery business along the highway called police after discovering items in a storage shed behind the building. Inside were a child's hair ribbon, a green marker, a pencil, and several candy wrappers. The candy matched what Leela had received during a school event the weekend before she disappeared. The shed was searched thoroughly. No fingerprints, no DNA that could be conclusively tied to Leela. The items were logged and photographed, then returned to evidence storage, offering more questions than answers. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months. The Turners kept Leela's room exactly as it was. Her backpack photo stared back from flyers all over the county. Denise barely slept. Marcus returned to work only because he had to, carrying the weight of unanswered questions into every shift. Police quietly shifted their language. They stopped suggesting Leela had simply wandered off. Something else had happened, something darker. 18 months later, a construction worker nearly 30 miles away unearthed a double-bagged trash bundle buried on a rural property. Inside was a child's backpack. Leela's name and phone number were written inside. That discovery would change everything. But in Pine Hollow, where the rain still fell some nights like it did that February evening, the question that haunted everyone remained the same. Why did Leela leave the house at all, and who was waiting for her when she did? By the time spring arrived in Pine Hollow, the search for Lila Mae Turner had become part of the town's daily rhythm. Her face stared out from flyers caped to telephone poles, grocery store bulletin boards, and church doors. People spoke her name softly, as if saying it too loudly might make the reality settle in more firmly. For the Turners, time moved strangely. Days blurred together, marked only by police updates that never brought real answers. Detectives revisited the Turner home multiple times in the weeks following Lila's disappearance. They measured the height of the backyard wall, examined the stacked lawn chairs Denise had noticed that morning, and photographed shoe impressions in the damp soil that matched the size of Lila's sneakers. The conclusion was unsettling but clear. Lila had likely used the chairs to climb over the wall and leave the yard on her own. The question no one could answer was why. Investigators combed through Lila's school life, interviewing teachers, classmates, and counselors. By all accounts, she was a quiet, well-behaved child. She struggled with confidence, but had never shown signs of wanting to run away. Her teacher described her as gentle to the point of invisibility, the kind of student who raised her hand only when she was absolutely certain of the answer. At home, nothing suggested a plan. There were no notes, no packed bags, no money missing. Lila had left behind her favorite stuffed animal, the one she slept with every night. To Denise, that detail alone proved her daughter never intended to stay away. The highway sightings haunted Marcus. He replayed them constantly in his mind, imagining his 9-year-old daughter walking alone in the rain, terrified, pushing herself forward for reasons no one understood. The shed discovery only deepened the mystery. Why stop there? Why leave those items behind? As months passed, tips poured in from neighboring counties and even other states. Most went nowhere, some were clearly mistaken, others felt cruel in their vagueness. Phone calls from people who claimed to feel something or who insisted they had seen Lila without offering any detail that could be verified. Then, in August of the following year, everything shifted. A contractor named Wesley Hart was clearing land on a wooded property outside the town of Redfield, nearly 30 miles north of Pine Hollow. While digging near a stand of pine trees, his equipment struck something buried shallowly beneath the soil. Curious, Hart climbed down and pulled free a black trash bag. Inside it was another bag, tightly wrapped with duct tape. When he opened the second bag, he froze. Inside was a child's backpack. Hart contacted the sheriff's office immediately. When investigators arrived and examined the contents, they found a name written inside the lining in careful block letters, Lila Mae Turner. Beneath it, a phone number that hadn't changed since the day she vanished. The discovery made national news. Reporters descended on Pine Hollow, knocking on doors, filming the highway where Lila had last been seen, speculating openly about what the backpack meant. For the Turners, it was both devastating and strangely relieving. After more than a year of uncertainty, there was proof that Lila had been somewhere else. Someone had taken her belongings and buried them deliberately. Police searched the Redfield property extensively. Cadaver dogs were brought in, soil samples were taken. Nothing else connected to Lila was found. A pair of men's khaki pants was recovered nearby, weathered and partially decomposed. Investigators confirmed they did not belong to anyone in the Hart family, but no public results were released regarding DNA testing. Behind closed doors, detectives shifted their working theory. Lila had not wandered aimlessly into the night. Someone had encountered her on that highway. Someone had taken her. In the years that followed, the case remained active but stagnant. Denise gave interviews whenever asked, repeating the same plea, "Bring my daughter home." Marcus avoided the cameras but attended every vigil, every prayer service, standing silently at the back. In 2016, a new tip reignited hope. A woman came forward claiming she had seen a young girl matching Lila's description getting into a dark green sedan along Route 41 on the night she disappeared. She described the car as an older model, possibly from the 1970s. Another witness later echoed the claim, recalling a similar vehicle parked along the shoulder around the same time. Investigators released a public request for information about two specific cars, a dark green 1974 Lincoln Continental and a 1976 Ford Thunderbird. They asked anyone who owned or seen such vehicles in the area to come forward. The announcement sent a ripple through Pine Hollow. People began re-examining old memories, wondering if they had overlooked something years ago. Despite renewed attention, no arrests followed. Time marched on, leaving the Turners suspended in a strange limbo. Lila would have been graduating middle school, then high school. Denise marked each birthday by lighting candles on a cake she could no longer bring herself to eat. Marcus kept a notebook by his bed, writing down fragments of thoughts, questions he would ask Lila if he ever saw her again. In October of 2019, investigators held another press conference, this time focusing on two items they believed were crucial. The first was a children's book, The Silver Pond, checked out from a local middle school library shortly before Lila vanished. The second was a concert T-shirt from a popular boy band, several sizes too large for her. Neither item belonged to Lila. Her parents were certain of that. The implication was chilling. Someone else had given her those things, someone she trusted enough to follow. For years, the case sat quietly in the background of law enforcement files, resurfacing only on anniversaries. Then, in September of 2024, a series of sealed search warrants were unsealed, revealing new information that stunned the public. The documents identified a family from the outskirts of Pine Hollow, the Carters, as having a possible connection to Lila's disappearance. The family had lived in the area at the time and later moved several times within the state. According to the warrants, DNA belonging to one of the Carter children had been found on an item connected to Lila. Multiple properties linked to the family were searched. Investigators seized computers, digital storage devices, clothing, cameras, and a smartwatch. One dark green vehicle was also taken from a garage behind one of the homes. Police emphasized that the investigation was ongoing and no suspects had been named. For the Turners, the news reopened wounds they had spent decades learning to live with. Denise felt hope creep back in, fragile and terrifying. Marcus remained cautious. He had learned what hope could do when it was taken away again. As Lila's story drew to a close, the truth felt closer than it had ever been, yet still just out of reach. Somewhere between buried backpacks, half-remembered sightings, and sealed warrants, the answers waited. And Pine Hollow held its breath once more, knowing that whatever came next would finally change everything.
The release of the search warrants changed everything, even though it did not immediately deliver the answers everyone wanted. For the first time in decades, the disappearance of Lila Mae Turner no longer felt frozen in the past. It felt active, alive, moving forward. Detectives working the case were careful with their words. They stressed that the Carters had not been charged with any crime. They repeated again and again that an investigation was not an accusation. Still, in a town as small as Pine Hollow, the name spread quickly. People whispered in grocery store aisles and church parking lots, connecting dots that may or may not have belonged together. For Denise and Marcus Turner, the unsealing of the warrants was both a relief and a new kind of torment. For years, they had begged police not to let the case fade into a cold file. Now it was front and center again, dissected by reporters and strangers who had opinions but no real stake in the outcome. What mattered to them was simple. Someone knew what happened to their daughter. Investigators revealed that the DNA connection came from an item recovered years earlier, but only recently retested using updated forensic technology. The item itself was not publicly identified, but sources close to the case confirmed it had been associated with Leela shortly after her disappearance. The DNA did not belong to Leela or anyone in her family. It belonged to another child. That detail alone shifted the entire narrative. It suggested proximity, familiarity, a shared space where two children's paths had crossed. Detectives began reconstructing timelines from the late 1990s, reviewing school records, neighborhood events, and social gatherings that had once seemed insignificant. They also revisited the night Leela disappeared with fresh eyes. The storm, once considered a strange contradiction to her fears, now appeared differently. Investigators theorized that Leela may not have left spontaneously. Someone could have told her to come outside, someone she trusted, someone who knew she would be awake late. The stacked lawn chairs became more than a detail. They suggested preparation, not long-term planning, but enough intention to matter, enough confidence to believe she could get back inside if needed, or enough trust to believe she wouldn't need to. Police also took another look at the shed along Route 41. At the time, the discovery of the hair bow and candy wrappers had felt promising, but ultimately led nowhere. Now, with the possibility of a vehicle involved, detectives questioned whether the shed had been a temporary stop, a place where Leela waited or hid. The buried backpack remained one of the most troubling elements of the case. Its location made little sense unless someone deliberately transported it there. The fact that it had been double-bagged suggested an attempt to preserve it or conceal it, not discarded casually. That alone contradicted any theory involving a child wandering off and succumbing to the elements. Behind the scenes, investigators worked quietly, interviewing individuals connected to the properties listed in the warrants. Old acquaintances were asked about green cars, late-night drives, and unexplained absences from work or school. Digital forensic experts analyzed seized devices, searching for deleted files, location data, and long-forgotten messages. Every step forward brought another wave of tension. Denise followed the updates obsessively. She reread old journals she had kept in the early years after Leela vanished, noting details she had once dismissed. A comment Leela made about a book someone lent her, a t-shirt she had admired on another child at church. Small things that now felt enormous. Marcus struggled differently. He had learned to live with uncertainty, to carry it like a weight that never quite crushed him, but never loosened either. Now that the case was active again, that weight shifted. It pressed in new places. At night, he dreamed of Leela as she might look now, grown and unfamiliar, calling his name from somewhere just out of sight. Public interest surged after the warrants were made public. True crime podcasts revisited the case. Online forums filled with speculation, some thoughtful, others reckless. Police urged the public not to harass anyone named in the documents, reminding them that rumors could damage the investigation. In Pine Hollow, people tried to return to normal life, but normal had never truly returned after Leela disappeared. Her story had become part of the town's identity. Every child who walked to school alone, every stormy night, every flickering porch light carried echoes of that morning when Denise opened the bedroom door and found an empty bed. As months passed, authorities confirmed that several items seized during the searches were undergoing forensic testing. They declined to comment on results, but emphasized that progress was being made. It was the most hopeful language the Turners had heard in years. The family held a quiet vigil on the anniversary of Leela's disappearance, not for the cameras, but for themselves. They lit 9 candles, one for each year of Leela's life before she vanished. Denise spoke softly, not to the crowd, but to her daughter. "We are still here, and we are not giving up." Investigators acknowledge that solving a case this old came with challenges. Memories fade, evidence degrades, people move, change, die. But they also pointed out that time can work both ways. Guilt weighs heavier as years pass, secrets grow harder to keep, technology improves. The possibility that Leela may have lived beyond that night remained an open question. While police believed foul play was involved, they stopped short of confirming when or how she died, or if she had at all. For the Turners, that sliver of uncertainty was painful but necessary. It kept hope alive even when logic argued against it. As the investigation continued, detectives asked the public for one thing above all else: think back. Think carefully. Think about the cars you saw, the people who acted strangely, the moments that didn't make sense at the time. Because someone, somewhere, knew something. In the final analysis, Leela Mae Turner's story was no longer just about a child who vanished in the night. It was about a community that refused to forget her, about parents who endured the unimaginable and kept standing, about the slow, often frustrating pursuit of truth in a system that rarely moves fast enough for those left behind. Whether justice would come remained uncertain, but one thing was clear: Leela was not lost to silence. Her name was still spoken, her story still unfolding, and as long as questions remained unanswered, the search for her truth would continue, step by careful step, until the night she walked into the storm finally gave up its secrets.